BBC World News.
You're watching BBC News. I'm Shaun Ley, broadcasting live from the Victoria Hall in the city of Stoke-on-Trent in the English Midlands, where tonight the two candidates who would be the next British Prime Minister hold their first head-to-head debate. We're live with full coverage in the next half hour. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss will be debating the issues here before a live audience, but they've already clashed over national policy on China and immigration. Labour's leader Sir Keir Starmer has attacked his Conservative rival's approach. He accused the Conservative Party of indulging in Thatcherite cosplay. Perhaps fewer than 200,000 party members will make the choice of who is to be the country's next Prime Minister. The announcement comes on September the 5th. And the former leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, a key architect in the Northern Ireland peace agreement which brought the Good Friday Agreement and an end to the Northern Ireland Troubles, has died at the age of 77. Hello, I'm Shaun Ley. A warm welcome to viewers around the world who are joining us here in Stoke. Behind me, you can probably see now filling up with journalists from the UK and around the world who will be reporting a debate that is not only about who will lead Britain's ruling Conservative Party over the next up to 2 years before a general election has to be held, but also who will be the UK's next Prime Minister in succession to Boris Johnson, who was deposed by his party a few weeks ago. One of the causes of that deposition was the resignation of his finance minister, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak. Well, he's one of the candidates tonight. The other is the serving Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, both of them with wide international experience, both of them acutely conscious of Britain's place in the world and the challenges of its involvement in the Ukraine war, its decision to leave the European Union and its search for trade deals around the globe. We begin tonight with words on the debate itself from its host, Sophie Rayworth.
This is Victoria Hall in Stoke-on-Trent. Now, this is one of those so-called red wall seats that turned blue at the last election back in 2019. I'll be joined, of course, by the two candidates, but also by a studio audience, all people who voted Conservative, some for the first time, in 2019. I'm also joined tonight by our political editor, Chris Mason, our economics editor, Faisal Islam. Chris, what will you be looking for?
A few fascinating things, I think, to keep an eye on tonight, Sophie. The first thing is our audience here. As you say, all Conservative voters last time round, some for the first time in 2019. So they were charmed by a Conservative Party led by Boris Johnson. So the biggest test, in many senses, for the two wannabe Prime Ministers at their lecterns later is to what extent can they charm this audience and keep them on side for the Conservative cause, because that will determine whether or not, in the end, they can be election winners. The other point is the tension between them. And to what extent does that bubble out tonight? Because the opinion polls and surveys suggest that Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, is considerably behind Liz Truss. So the stakes for him in particular are really high. And just a week before those ballot papers arrive with Conservative members, tonight, arguably a chance for him to try and shift the dial. But with that, the stakes are high.
And Faisal, one thing that does divide them, the economy.
Yeah, there's a material chance that this leadership campaign leads to a change in economic policy. That's both tax and spend and possibly monetary policy, what the Bank of England does too. These are up in the air. And crucially, this all leads back to the cost of living crisis and what might change for households at home. Various policies are being offered. We haven't had all the detail. We'll be looking very carefully to see if it all adds up.
So that's what people can expect when the programme begins at the top of the next hour. Let's talk now to someone who's been an insider in the Conservative Party and in government as well, Anita Boateng, who joins us now. Anita, thank you very much for being with us on BBC News. I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, particularly for those people who know little or nothing about British politics, to give us a little pen portrait of these two candidates. Rishi Sunak first.
I think The Chancellor, or the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is someone who considers himself to be a strong debater, who considers himself to be very serious when it comes to tackling the challenges that the economy faces, and who considers himself to be someone who is trustworthy. And that's the reason why I think he's made that such a central plank of his economic platform. And he's really trying to tell the party, like he's been trying to tell MPs, and eventually, if he succeeds, will be telling the public that it's time to be realistic and responsible. And that's about making tough choices to steward the economy on to safer grounds. I think that is the thing that's going to come through in these debates this evening.
He did resign from the cabinet, and so for some Conservatives, presumably that will be enough of a reason not to support him, because he didn't show loyalty, in their view, to the outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Liz Truss did stay loyal, but she's characterising herself as the insurgent. How come?
Well, I think there's two different questions here, right? There's a question of loyalty to Boris Johnson, which I think is one part of the campaign, though I would argue actually not as big a factor as you might imagine. But the second is about challenging orthodoxy. You know, Liz Truss has very much presented herself as ripping up the economic rule book and saying that there is a way that you don't have to make tough choices and you can, quote unquote, go for growth, and as such deliver the kinds of revenue that you need to mean that you don't need to raise taxes significantly. So I think it's an insurgent campaign insofar as she is challenging quite a long period of economic orthodoxy.
Let's talk about what the risks and the rewards are of a debate of this kind. Is it a format that is going to flatter the candidates, or would there be some concern, particularly in the party and perhaps in government, that it might simply encourage division?
I think that's a very good question. Both of the candidates sort of need this to go incredibly well. The stakes are very high. You know, the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, kind of needs a game changer. It's very clear from the polling. It's telling one consistent story, which is that party members are not yet convinced that Sunak would be the best Prime Minister. And Truss, you know, who's admitted freely to not being the strongest debater, definitely needs to not fall over or trip up or do anything to weaken her lead amongst voters. I think that's a really good general question about the health of the party. So far, these debates have been robust, and some of that's been really great because it's been focused on the issues, and it's really important that if the Conservative Party is going to once again pull off the coup of renewing and off it, it's able to air its differences and really come with a, you know, you don't have two candidates basically saying, I will do what Boris Johnson did, but I will just do it better because I'll be more competent and more trustworthy. They are really setting out slightly different economic and actually broader stalls for the party to decide between. But that obviously is difficult for the party because it does mean, in some ways, critiquing what has come before. And so there is a fear about, you know, this could be ammunition for the Labour Party. But fundamentally, if the Conservative Party can find itself a strong Prime Minister who can put a new perspective to the country, that will help the Conservative Party succeed in the next general election.
Now, a lot of the audience will be people who voted Conservative at the last election. A lot of the people watching won't be Conservative voters, certainly not Conservative Party members. How big a challenge is that to try and bridge the gap between what Conservative supporters might want to hear and what people who aren't Conservatives might want to hear from the Prime Minister of their country?
Well, at this stage, I think it's right that the two members are talking to Conservatives. And I would say that Conservative members and Conservative voters are not that far apart. They might have slightly different economic backgrounds, members might be slightly less diverse, might be slightly older. But in terms of their core tenets of the belief, I've never really been convinced that they're that different. I think a lot of people will be watching this just to see the new candidates for the first time and potential prime ministers. I think at this stage, in terms of what the ultimate prize is, they will be very focused on winning over Conservative voters. But part of that, and part of winning over Conservative members in particular, is being able to convince them that they could win a general election. So there is this dual game going on, right, of one-upmanship with your opponent, of wanting to paint a vision for the future whilst not denigrating everything that happened in the past, and also of wanting to talk to Conservative Party members, but also making sure that electability is always foremost in their minds, because Conservative members do really care about being able to have a Prime Minister that wins elections.
Anita Bertang, former Conservative Special Advisor, thank you very much. Very interesting thoughts there on why this matters and how they might handle the debate to come at the top of the hour. Let's talk to Annalise Dodds now. Annalise was former Shadow Chancellor for Labour. She now speaks for the party on women and equalities, and she also has an important campaigning role. Annalise Dodds, thank you very much for being with us on BBC News. Let me ask you first of all about what you think is the challenge that two members of the Boris Johnson cabinet, one current, one former, have to answer tonight.
Well, I think the challenge for both of them is to show whether they continue to be those continuity candidates. Both of them have been deeply implicated in the last 12 years that we've seen of Conservative-led governments, those 12 years that now are resulting in a low growth crisis, in our cost of living crisis being so intense in Britain compared to in other countries, and our public services being in crisis, and so on and so forth. And I'm afraid they've been trying desperately, both of them, to distance themselves from all the being implicated in 15 tax rises that we've seen over recent months. But ultimately, they have been responsible for that failure. And we don't see any new clear plans coming from either of them, from either Liz Truss or indeed from Rishi Sunak. We don't see those plans for the stronger, more secure economy that we need. Keir Starmer was setting out those plans today. I'm afraid they certainly weren't coming from those Conservative candidates.
Keir's speech today, one of the planks of that was the proposals for a new body to develop industrial strategy. Some voters might ask, after 12 years in opposition, you're proposing to take office and then develop an industrial strategy. Yet the Chancellor, at least, or former Chancellor, is saying there's a crisis and we would have to deal with it on day one.
And we would deal with it on day one. And that's why this council that Keir set out is one of a number of elements that we have already said the government needs to be introducing right now. You know, we've been very clear that we need to be buying, making and selling far more in our own country, using the power of procurement to attracting jobs to our country rather than which is what we've seen time and time again under Conservative-led governments. We set out how we would be delivering economic security and energy security. Again, right now, we would be insulating homes, getting people's bills down on average by about £400, not just this year, but every year into the future. So Keir was setting out additional elements of our economic strategy today, but we have been very, very clear about our plans. And I would just outline again the difference between Labour and the Conservatives there, being clear about our plans. Also, incidentally, Labour being very clear about how we would pay for those plans. You know, we're not setting out unfunded tax cuts here, there and everywhere like these Conservative candidates. We said, for example, we would cut VAT on energy bills, and we said how we paid for that. We would pay for that by starting that windfall tax earlier, by not going ahead with the government's plans on investment allowance. Now, we think the British people deserve respect, and that includes respect around how their money will be used to drive economic growth in the future under Labour.
Now, in terms of the political reality of the situation, the Conservatives still have a significant parliamentary majority, as shown by them unsurprisingly winning the vote of confidence that they called in preference to the one that your party had proposed. They therefore have up to 2 years under a new Prime Minister to establish a fresh start, to change gear, to, as they would see it, kind of reform themselves in office. Isn't that a real political risk for you as an opposition party, that you've spent the last couple of years honing your attacks on Boris Johnson? You now have to deal with completely different.
Well, the fact is that the next Conservative leader is not going to be completely different. I mean, we saw Boris Johnson trying to distance himself from Conservative policies. He wasn't able to do peace with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak because they have been implicated in the last 12 years that we've seen, those years of really slow growth in the UK compared to other nations, and predicted slow growth if we continue with those Conservative policies. In fact, the slowest growth out of all of the G20, apart from Russia being predicted for our country under Conservative policies. So I'm afraid what we're likely to see is yet more Conservative continuity. Whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, we won't be seeing that fresh start with either of them. There would be a fresh start with Labour. That's where the difference lies.
Let me ask you finally, Annalise Dodds, about something that John Caldwell, the entrepreneur, philanthropist, very successful businessman in an area like the potteries. One way the two candidates have both said they would do it is by easing the Solvency II regulations that were passed by the EU to allow pension funds in particular to invest in some of the things that aren't listed, to give new startups fresh capital. Is that the kind of reform that a Labour government or a Labour Party in opposition indeed could endorse?
Well, I have to say we've seen a lot of noise around those kind of reforms for a very, very long time from the Conservatives, and they haven't delivered on that. You know, Labour set out again very clear plans about how we would get startups going. We've announced an ambition of 100,000 new startups. We've set out how we would deliver that. We've also set out how we would be completely removing that business rates regime that holds so many startups back at the beginning of their economic lives, and how we would be radically reforming that system to be fairer for business. So what I really want to see tonight from Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss isn't yet more promises around some of these regulatory issues. I actually want them to be acting on that change that's needed for business, rather than yet more vague promises, because frankly, we've had those from the Conservatives for many, many years.
Let me ask you finally about Labour's record in Stoke. You lost all 3 parliamentary seats over the course of a couple of elections. You lost control of the council. It is now run by the Conservatives jointly with Independents as a minority administration. I was talking to one party member who is also involved prominently in local community groups on this channel this afternoon, and she said really Labour had to accept it to let down the people of Stoke. Isn't there, in all the attacks on the Conservative record, particularly as it affects this part of England, perhaps room for a bit of humility from the Labour Party, which had political control of this area for decades and yet saw it decline?
Well, of course, Labour had to be and continues to be humble after, unfortunately, we lost that 2019 general election, including, of course, our representation in Stoke quite so catastrophically. Of course, we need to reflect on what happened there, learn those lessons, and we have been doing that. We've been doing that, in fact, every single day, because I'm absolutely determined, and I've talked with many people in Stoke over the years. I know how ambitious they are for their communities, the huge potential that there is in places like Stoke. And just as Keir said this morning, we have got to have that stronger, more secure, fairer economy for the future. And that means using what should be the wealth of places like Stoke, that incredible industrial heritage, the people based there, the energy, the ambition that they have for their areas. That must be delivered on. And we've had so much hot air around this with alleged levelling up recently. It's not delivered. Labour is setting out how we will change that into the future. We will make sure we have that stronger, more secure economy up and down the country. And I hope that people in Stoke will be hearing that and will be looking again at Labour. Certainly that's been my experience, that people are looking again at Labour, even if they turned away from us previously.
Annalise Dodds from the Labour Party, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Well, let's talk finally about the challenge of this debate, in particular in terms of the context of this part of England. These are the seats, remember, that have tended to be summarised as the Red Wall. It's a bit further south, Stoke, than the Red Wall. The English novelist of the early 20th century wrote of the 5 towns because he thought it sounded better than the 6 towns. And in fact, there are 6 towns that make up Stoke. They're at the heart of the potteries. They're at the heart of the coal industry for many years. Globalisation has changed the nature of employment in lots of places, no less than the case here in Stoke. I'm joined by Dr. Phil Catney. Phil is from Keele University in Staffordshire, from the neighbouring town Newcastle under Lyme, where your university is based. From your perspective, what do you see as the challenge that faces the Conservatives in holding on here in terms of what has happened in this part of England and in those places that were once loyally Labour for so many decades, some cases for a century, ever since the Labour Party was founded, but in 2019, or indeed in the couple of years before, slipped out of Labour's hands and into the Conservatives?
Yes, well, the Conservative Party was very effective at being opportunistic around Labour's problems. Labour was governing a lot of post-industrial towns in the north of England that have struggled economically, and there are very complex reasons why these cities are left behind, fallen behind, unproductive, whatever language you want to use. But the simple reality is that they've got very significant challenges that need to be addressed. Poverty is very high in cities like Stoke-on-Trent, but in the Red Wall. Now, the Conservatives have won a large majority in 2019 on a promise of levelling up. Boris Johnson's shtick was about levelling up. They need to do this. Now, the problem they have is that many of the councils in the north of England are still significant employers in the local area, but they've seen significant cuts in their budgets over the last decade.
I mean, 10 years ago, I think I'm right in saying that Stoke Council was the biggest employer in Stoke.
Yes, it was, and it's seen hundreds of millions of pounds taken off it when they changed the nature of how you calculated the central government block grant that came to local authority areas. So it's ironic at one level the Conservatives created this financial problem and then benefited from it because the councils took the blame. But that's the nature of central local government relations in the UK. National government sets the financial envelope for local government. People don't often realise how little is actually raised locally and spent locally. But the point there is that the Conservatives have to think of a way of now continuing this legacy. What we'll possibly hear, maybe, given the location, I hope we do, is hear some clear ideas about what they're going to do. How are they going to generate this enterprise? Is it going to be more low tax, free ports but inland in Stoke-on-Trent? We've had this in the last decade.
Well, they had the canal, I guess.
Yes, they had the canal. Go back to the 19th century ideas of transportation. But seriously, there's a serious problem here about how we regenerate a place that's got such legacy issues. It's got a poorly interconnected city. It's got significant pockets of deprivation that simply aren't going to disappear overnight. And significant investment needs to be made in these areas. But how? And that's what we're going to listen for tonight.
Thank you very much for now, Phil. We'll speak again. Let's talk to Graham Hutton now, who is the leader of Newcastle under Lyme Council. As I was saying to Phil there, Graham, yours is the next community along from Stoke. But it's fair to say, isn't it, that the two areas really flow into each other. From your perspective in local government, what do you want to hear from the two respective candidates tonight that might give you some hope for your town, which also is one that was once Labour but became Conservative?
Just a slight correction, I'm the leader of the Newcastle Conservative Association, not the council.
Forgive me.
That's okay. They're standing as leaders, so what do I expect from a leader? I expect good communication skills, a view of what the future is going to be. I want them to know their own strengths and build a strong team and actually delegate to that team rather than try and do everything themselves. So that's what I'm looking for. At the moment, I'm quite happy to have either of them, but the hustings have to show me how good they are at addressing what we expect to see in a leader, and particularly addressing the issue of Ukraine, which is causing the cost of living crisis, and building the economy so it's fit for the future.
Are they talking too much about tax at the moment?
It depends. You'll always find an economist to back your position. I do think that we have to grow the economy and probably bring some things back that we've outsourced to China. I think COVID and the Putin's war in Ukraine has shown us the fragility of the supply chain, and we've got to get that much more into control in this country. So that's the start. Let's get that supply chain sorted and our energy sorted. So and those are all possible. They're all easy to do relatively.
Let me ask you finally about one other thing that Phil mentioned and several of my interviews have mentioned today, and that is levelling up. It's a phrase that people seem to have kind of absorbed. They now have a sense of what it's supposed to mean, but they're still doubtful over how much has actually been achieved on that agenda. You're at the sharp end of it. How big a challenge does that remain for the government?
We've got over 50 million in Newcastle under Lyme, and if you come back in 18 months, 2 years' time, you'll see a massive difference in the town centre. We've already started, we've knocked down the old council offices, we're building a lot more housing in the centre because housing brings footfall and that supports the retail and the leisure industry. So Newcastle is looking at a rosy future. We've got a lot of new jobs coming. We'll be building new houses to support people. And I think levelling up is working for places like Newcastle because we're getting the investment and we're being supported by government to support our very well-run council.
Graham Hutton there, Chairman of the Newcastle Under Lyme Conservative Association. Apologies for getting your title wrong. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk a bit briefly, before we go back to Phil, a little bit about the heritage of this area, because it's a very important part of what makes Stoke special. It really dates from the last quarter of the 18th century when the Trent and Mersey Canal was dug. Abundant supplies of both coal and clay combined together with the talent of ceramicists and potters to make products that made Stoke a name around the world. Dalton, Minton, Wedgwood, of course, Josiah Wedgwood, the great champion of Stoke. I've been talking to a man who, whether you watch television in the UK or around the world, you may well know, Eric Knowles, who is a ceramics specialist on the popular programme Antiques Roadshow, among many others. He gave me a sense of why that legacy of ceramics is so important to Stoke.
Way back in the Middle Ages, through into the 17th century, and into the early 18th century, it was just a cottage industry. People making pots to supply the local area. And then with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and in particular, Josiah Wedgwood, then everything changed. The factory systems came into being, and huge volumes were being made for everyday use, as well as some exceptional pieces that would have been decorated for those with deep pockets. But Stoke in later years became famous for steelworks and coal mining. I think it was the fact that coal was in the area and the local clays were in the area that the pottery industry actually did begin to thrive. Now, it goes without saying that in the last 20 years or more, the pottery industry in Stoke has taken a serious hit. I mean, there are potters out there who are doing good business, but a lot of them are just small time. When I say small time, I mean they are basically operations of 3 or 4 or 5 people. So in some ways, the pottery industry in Stoke has reverted back to that almost cottage industry. So there's still some great pots being made in Stoke-on-Trent. But I've been going there for the past 45 years and more. In fact, I'm something of an honourable Stokey. The museums there are breathtaking. If you're a pottery person, Stoke-on-Trent is nirvana.
So if you are heading to England for a holiday, put the potteries on your schedule. That's it from me here in the Victoria Hall in Stoke. In just a few moments' time, we'll be going inside the hall to my left, where we'll be hearing from the two candidates who would be the next Conservative leader and Britain's next Prime Minister from the beginning of September. Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, and the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. Introduced by Sophie Rayworth, this is the BBC's Our Next Prime Minister.